I'm Jim Coonan, the Press Freedom Fellow at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. I hope everyone is well and healthy and undaunted by cabin fever. We appreciate you making the time to be here for Writing Through Resilience and Community. Before our guests begin, I had a few housekeeping notes. We're looking forward to a great conversation between our guests for the first half of the program, and then we'll open it up to questions. And you can share your questions using the Q&A tool or chat tool at the bottom of your screen. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our two distinguished writers today. Connie Schultz, writer and journalist, a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist, author of 2 nonfiction books, and now out with her first novel, The Daughters of Erie Town. And we can't wait until it becomes available in June, I believe.
Yes, June.
And we're so happy to have Jon Mooallem, writer at large for the New York Times Magazine. His book, Wild Ones, was chosen as the best book of 2013 by a range of publications, including the New York Times Book Review. And this year he's out with This Is Chance, and an absolutely riveting account of the 1964 Alaska earthquake, a tale of resilience, a tale of a budding city in the frontier of America. And so with that, I'd just like to start with a broad question for both of you, and you can take it from there. What is the relationship for you between writing, resilience, and community?
Connie, you've nominated me to
I
go
did.
first. Okay, well, yeah. I mean, I think it's a subject that's been on my mind, probably for the entire last 6 years that I was working on this book, because the book is very much about the role of a particular journalist in Anchorage, a radio reporter named Jeannie Chance, who after this tremendous earthquake became a very vital source of information for the community. And one, wrinkle of the story, which I did not really understand going into it, was the way that having a reliable information and having honest information, having reporters there telling the community what was happening and what needed to be done, really became like a glue that held people together. So you had a lot of energy after the disaster, a lot of volunteer, people just wanting to leap in and help and not knowing how to do it. And somehow, having this node in the center of people who were unafraid to kind of, tell it like it is, for lack of a better phrase, and to do so with credibility, and with a kind of capability to make that information digestible, really allowed everyone to focus that energy in really productive ways. And you see, examples all over the community of Anchorage of people being able to act in a resourceful and very level-headed way and solve these problems that were opening up in front of them, because they had that sort of point to begin to orient themselves in the new reality. So yeah, I think it's all very linked. I think that, we need that kind of communication. We're seeing, a real lack of it now, I think, which causes a lot of confusion and uncertainty and fear. And we need those people to feel like the civilians and the general population can be trusted to know what's happening.
I want to reiterate what I said to Jon privately a little bit ago. I love his book and I recommend it to everyone because it is so immediately relevant in ways you couldn't have predicted when you were working on it. And I've loved reading it and I've learned from reading it. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I understand we have a lot of students, college students, journalism students and writers, in addition to other writers who are watching us in this moment. So I want to talk for just a moment specifically to the young writers among us, that you will be the storytellers of this pandemic, I feel, because the pandemic is going to last, the impact of this pandemic is going to last for decades. And so telling the stories now, even if they're just, first of all, I do recommend a journal. If you've never kept a journal, I recommend it now. The process of writing helps us figure out what we're feeling and thinking in the moment. I've often said when I'm working on my columns, I'm not quite sure how I feel until I'm in the process of writing them, because I have to articulate and I have to narrow down exactly what I think matters in the moment. But I also know the value of interviewing others. Most of us, and this includes all ages, most of us right now know people that we would love to see but can't, or we're living with people who are struggling in their own ways, or we know and love essential workers. I was thinking just this morning, really talking to my husband, that my novel includes two of the main characters are essential workers, a utility worker and a nurse's aide, which is what my parents were. And were they alive now and of working age, they would have to work, and I'd really be worried about them. We're not talking to them as much as I'd like to see. And I think these interviews, including grandparents who you can't see, siblings, loved ones, interviewing them is good for you because it keeps you finely tuned to the world around you and what people are thinking and feeling. And it's wonderful for them often because seldom does anyone ask what they're thinking or how they feel. And there's an honor in that as well. And that's what I would encourage right now in terms of the resilience of a community and using writing to help with that, because the storytellers, history, who tells this history? Who will be the storytellers this time? And we may think we'll never forget this moment. We'll remember the history of it, but we won't always remember how we felt in that moment. And I say that as somebody who chronicled a year-long campaign of my husband in 2006. I was so sure I would never forget some things, but I ended up being really glad I took all those notes, because it's coming at you so fast. And in that way, it's similar to this pandemic. It's so unpredictable day by day what's happening. And taking those notes helps us make sense of this.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the novel, Connie, because I mean, it's gorgeous, and it's so vivid. You know, the people that you're writing, especially the protagonist Ellie, is a woman who just seems so real in her particulars, but also so almost, you know, familiar as a type of person, right? And you know, I think it's maybe it's a Midwestern. I'm not a Midwesterner, so I don't want to speak for you Midwesterners, but it seems a very Midwestern type of working class woman who is, you know, sort of internalized that her role is to hold things together for everyone else. And I guess I know there's some parallels with your own story, but just to pick up on what you were saying, like, I'm curious what, obviously there's some truths there that you felt you had to explore within fiction rather than, you know, in nonfiction or with interviewing, but also I imagine that a lot of research or personal experience went into that. And so I'm curious, like, why you made that leap, and if you feel like there, as you're saying, like there's an importance to chronicle what's happening. What are the differences between mediums, you know, between fiction and nonfiction, and how do you feel like each could be useful right now?
Well, I often quote May Sarton, who wrote many years ago, "Only in fiction, perhaps, can we tell the whole truth." And so, of course, the people of my roots, I'm a working class person. I was the first in my family to go to college. And so many of the people, when you grow up in a small town, as I did, everyone thinks they're helping to raise you, and they often are. And so their spirit and the truths of their lives certainly show up. But Ellie is, there is some of my mother in Ellie, because she is a nurse's aide. And there's a scene in the book where she makes a list of all her job duties as a nurse's aide, because she doesn't think her husband understands why her job matters. That list was actually my mother's, part of my mother's, which we didn't discover until after her death. Wow. And she made enough copies for everyone in the family, which makes me really wonder, did she think none of us understood why she thought her job mattered? It really was an emotional moment, emotional discovery. And I thought, well, Ellie is like so many women in the world, regardless of where they live, where they are so important to their communities and to their families, but they never know it. And seldom does anyone tell them. But thank you for asking about that. I was wondering how often you've been to Anchorage in the coverage of this. I mean, it's a remote place to be spending so much time reporting.
Yeah, well, I live outside Seattle, so it's not as that was the first shock of moving up to the Pacific Northwest, is suddenly Alaska did not feel like another planet. You tend to meet a lot of people who grew up there, and yeah, you know, the interesting thing, and because the project was historical, you know, it's all a chronicle of basically 3 days that happened in 1964. There were people still around to visit with and talk about, but just by sheer luck, most of the book was written using archival documents. So there was just a really almost supernaturally detailed record of a lot of people's, you know, lives through those 3 days. And so I would end up going up to Anchorage. I went, I guess, 3 times, and elsewhere around Alaska to track other people down. But I would go with these sheaths of documents, you know, like you were just saying, it's important to write things down in the moment so you don't forget them. Well, there were a lot of interviews done at the time and a lot of record keeping and letters and diaries. All of that stuff was just sitting in boxes waiting to be found. So I would have these documents, and I would show up with you know, a bunch of specific questions, and I'd find myself asking these, you know, 80 or 85-year-old people. So on Saturday morning after the quake, you came to the police station at 9 a.m. And of course they would just kind of roll their eyes and say, well, I don't know. So yeah, I think it goes to your point, you know, in point of fact, I actually ended up spending more time in Delaware than Alaska for the book, because that's where in an archive there where a lot of these primary documents had wound up. But it goes to your point about the importance of getting this stuff down as it's.
Do you worry at all? Because I have this concern, of course I do, because I'm a writer and I put pen to paper so much. What kind of documents we're going to have available for the future chronicles of our lives and of this time we're in, because we do it so differently now.
Yeah, I do. You know, I can't say that I worried about that before I glimpsed how it used to be through working on this project, to just see the volume of material, and also that the material that was kept was very important. It wasn't hidden in this wash of, you know, messy, you know, one-line emails, right? So
Right.
I don't know I mean, I'm sure you probably had this experience writing the book about your husband's campaign too, where if you go back and try to look at something more recent, it's a completely different experience. I had the experience while I was working on the book of trying to write a story about something that had happened to me 20 years ago. And, you know, just looking at what I had preserved from that time compared to what I was able to find about something, you know, 50 some odd years ago, it was very dispiriting.
Yes.
So yeah, so I think your advice to everyone was completely spot on. It's something I'm failing to do, I think, largely because I'm spending most of the time chasing after my kids and trying to do work on the side. And somehow, you know, posterity is not the biggest concern right now. But yeah, I just would second exactly what you're saying.
I understand that. Also, one of the worst traits in a person is self-importance, right? And so, and writers tend not to be that way. And so do the women I write about often, and the people I write about, but they are the exact people we need to be hearing from. And if they're not taking any notes, or if no one's interviewing them and talking with them and writing those stories, they'll be lost to us. So
yeah, I mean, that it goes to what you're saying about your mother's list, right? I mean, I can imagine,
yeah, right.
that there is, no one could look at that and say, you know, oh, it's hubris, just writing down what she, but I think it feels that way sometimes, right? When you're sitting down.
Right.
You know. I mean, do you feel like, I mean, that was, you know, just so many of your columns too, and so much of your career was spent covering, you know, a community in Cleveland, but also just sort of a class of people that their stories normally aren't told. And I mean, do you feel like there are virtues that you have observed or skills? I mean, you basically saw, you know, Cleveland come from, you know, the depths of kind of a recession through, you know, forces beyond its control, and then sort of revive. And now I feel like we're sort of all dealing with that kind of uncertainty. And those people, those workers are sort of still the ones that are keeping everything running right now. So I don't know, I don't maybe have a specific question, but it just feels like you're kind of uniquely positioned to kind of be a conduit between, you know, that segment of society and others, and maybe show what we can learn from them.
Well, thanks for asking that. I feel, first of all, I tend to write about the rest of America, right? They're not professionals. They're not living on the coast. They're living in the rest of the country. The zip code we live in, 44105, where Shared I live, is in the city of Cleveland. And it had the highest foreclosure rate in the country in the beginning of 2007. So we, and a lot of our neighbors, we live in the largest development built in the city of Cleveland since World War II. So many of our fellow neighbors, first of all, we're racially diverse, which is really important to emphasize about working class. You know, I grew up in Little Ashtabula, Ohio. Half of my class in every grade through 6th grade was Black. And part of the reason I point that out, and I've written about it, is I really reject this notion that if you grow up white working class and you have racists in your family, which I did, it means you're automatically going to be a racist. You know, our roots are our beginnings, not our excuses. And if you grow up with other people who don't look like you, but they are the closest people in your life, you grow up with a very different attitude. So right now, when I think we've had the governor yesterday said that we no longer have to wear masks, it's not required. It's encouraged but no longer required, but workers must. What that means is workers must protect the people going into the grocery stores, showing up at the gas station, but we're no longer required to protect them. If you don't think that column almost writes itself this week, I never run out of reasons to keep reminding the rest of America that if you really think they're essential, could we please treat them as essential?
Yeah. The word essential seems to be taking, I mean, it's it's a pretty redolent term all of a sudden, right? That it doesn't mean, I think, what the people who initially started calling everyone that were really thinking that it should mean, but
no, yeah. That's right. I wish my dad were alive, just so I could call him essential just once to get that feedback. That would be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Hi, Jim, you're back.
I didn't mean to interrupt, and if you want to carry on, please do. But we do have some questions.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I wanted to go with this one. One viewer asks, what particular emotions have inspired or driven your stories and your writing? Have some emotions taken you in surprising directions?
Is this the emotions of others, I wonder? It must be, right?
I think the emotions of others, or how they make, or perhaps the emotions that you draw out of the characters that you're creating, or the people in both your cases who you're interviewing or chronicling in your stories. Do they draw surprising emotions from you as you talk to them, create them in a piece of fiction, or report them out, or find them in the research that you do?
Do you want me to go first on this one, John?
Sure. That would give me a second to tread water.
I saw your face. I thought maybe,
yeah.
That's a very good question. I would say fear is one of the things that most intrigues me, because fear is always about something else. In addition to what are you afraid of? When I write a lot about race and racism over the years, what you're afraid of is the unknown to me. Or if it's male working class workers, they're afraid of losing their place. They used to build big things and they feel so less important in the world. Women who are afraid to take chances and speak out, they're afraid of the criticism, they're afraid of being judged. So much of what has intrigued me over time is what makes people afraid. And can we get to the other layers of that so that we can, first of all, understand it better, and secondly, perhaps silence it somewhat in ourselves to live our bigger lives.
I'm not sure I have as profound an answer, but I was thinking about this recently, and I think I'm drawn to frustration. I think I'm drawn to people who feel frustrated or thwarted in some way. I think that, I mean, there's some deep psychological reason why I relate to that, but I also just think that when someone is feeling frustrated, it means they're probably in a pretty fascinating predicament. There's a good story there to tell. It brings up questions of, how do they think this thing should be going, and what idealism is inherent there, and it's sort of their vision of how things should be meeting a clumsier version of reality. So when I see someone's frustrated, I feel like there's always a good tale to tell.
That's great.
There's another question. It's directed at Jon, but I think, Connie, you might be able to find a way to get at this issue as well. And the question is, Jon, as you were writing about an event that's so long ago with the Alaska earthquake, how do you go about finding the information or finding subjects that were there? But I think that can also apply to Connie, as you were creating Erie Town. Who did you look for to kind of become the examples for your characters? But if Jon could take this.
Yeah, let's have Jon go first.
That was a big challenge, and that was actually why I spent a long time looking for research, looking for material before I sort of had the courage to write a book proposal and sell the book and commit to doing it, because I was just afraid, as someone who spends most of my time as a magazine journalist, there's usually always someone else you can call, some other place you can look to find information that you don't have. So when you hit a wall, there's a way around it. And I just had the feeling that was not going to be the case necessarily writing about history, that there would be questions that I just couldn't answer. And how was I going to feel when I confronted that? So in a lot of ways, I was lucky that I found a main character for the book, Jeannie Chance, this reporter who had left behind just a tremendous amount of documentation, recordings of radio broadcasts, letters, diaries, whatever it was, 40 boxes of her stuff in her daughter's basement, starting with the lock of her baby hair. And I think I don't know, if I were a real historian, I don't know if I would put it this way. And I think there is maybe something unfair about this in a more of a cosmic sense, but I just found I really had to tell the stories. I had to focus on the stories for which I had the best information. And that meant leaving, other really interesting things and people out, or pushing them more to the side of the story. But that was just the way that I really wanted to tell a story in a kind of intimate detail, and with a kind of granularity about, what someone was thinking and feeling during that time. And that was how I was able to do it.
Well, my novel spans 6 decades. And so I needed historical touchstones for myself throughout, and some of them were physical, like a train case factors in throughout the novel through 3 different generations of women. And I actually found one that was for sale in the 1950s. I found it on eBay, and I bought it because I needed it. I needed to see it, feel it, touch it, smell it, see it. So I have that. I have old recipe books because I wanted to make sure I had the right kind of meals happening in the working class. I have a Spam recipe book, which belonged to my mother, because we had 2 strikes when I was growing up and money was often tight. She was just a whiz with Spam, which I hope never to touch again in my entire life. And I also ordered, if you've ever seen in these stands and greeting card places and stuff, they have in the year you were born, and these pamphlets of what happened in the year you were born. I have them for every year from 1952 through 1996. And it was actually quite handy because it tends to be the popular references, right? Most famous song, most popular car, what was the most popular food or the mixed drink at the time. And it really helped me anchor it at times. So, and also a bunch of old Life magazines were very helpful that my father had saved. But one in particular that was sent by a friend who had no idea I was needing it, and I didn't know I needed it until I got it, which had a long interview with Annie Glenn. Ann and Johnny Glenn are both dear friends of ours. What it was like to be her while her husband was up circling the earth. And I ended up having that very issue in Ellie's hands at some point when she talks about how too many people don't talk about how brave Annie Glenn was too when John was in space.
Connie, I have Jeannie Chance's recipe book from Anchorage, and it says we can do a swap and compare Midwestern and Alaskan homemaker recipes from the mid-century.
The recipes are regional too, as you know.
Yeah.
All they have written notes and stuff. Oh, I love it.
I have 2 questions here that I think I can combine without ruining either one. It's how do you keep writing and reporting about COVID-19, but perhaps other issues as well, when you don't feel resilient during this time? What helps you put pen to page, and what kind of untraditional ways of staying inspired and avoiding writer's block do you employ while confined to your homes?
I'll go if that's okay. I am working in a very sporadic way right now. I'm not doing any reporting about COVID at the moment, but I think it's, if anything, that somehow makes it harder, I think, to feel motivated, because I feel like, oh, what's the use of this thing that I was assigned 3 months ago, right? But in terms of staying motivated, I think, well, concretely, I'd say I go for a lot of walks as well. So that's always, I like to go for a walk at the first thing in the morning. And then by the time I'm at my desk, I feel like I've accomplished something and I've got some momentum, and sometimes that will carry over into the writing. And I also think fear is always a good motivation, fear of failing or not getting a check, or that's, I sort of approach it in a very blue collar way, in that, that this is my job and I've agreed to do it. And, I'm very afraid of not living up to that obligation. So if you can find some kernel of fear and make that productive, that would be my very perhaps unhealthy but useful advice.
I would start by saying it's important to acknowledge when you're not feeling brave and when it is getting to you, and having conversations, because I find that very helpful. I feel a responsibility to be upbeat as much as I can be because I'm very active on social media and I'm a newspaper columnist. So I can't have a writer's block at least once a week because I have to file a column, right? But also writing is my normal. And so if I can get myself in the chair, I was just telling my editor at Random House, Kate Medina, yesterday that it seems to help me feel like I'm still doing what I'm meant to do. But I found on social media, one of the things I'm doing now is I take a lot of photographs. I always have. I have a lot of photographs from our childhood that my dad took. I took a lot of my kids during the time and now of my grandkids. And I'm using different photos and trying to bring a light touch often to remind people to breathe. Because breathing is actually, we know it can be helpful. We know it can help with stress. And it has struck me how many people have been responding to me and telling me that they didn't even realize how often they were holding their breath or breathing in a shallow way until they see the reminder to breathe. I'm doing that as much for me as for anyone else because it helps me stay upbeat. If I feel like I'm doing something and giving something back, and if I can make them smile, we got a lot of crazy grandkid pictures, and if it can lighten the mood for even a moment, I've decided that's enough. It's a very different attitude from being a columnist where you're constantly hoping you can at least engage people in a conversation and trying to get some people to think differently. Now I just want them in that moment to feel that break. It's become a very different thing.
So one perhaps last question, and I'm curious about your writing approach, because both of you, one, as Connie, as you mentioned, your story covers 6 decades. Jon, yours covers 3 days. But in each case, Connie, I'm sure you have to rely on specific description and detail to create your characters and give them life. And Jon, you are able to use detail also to tell the story of Anchorage writ large. So I'm curious about the use of detail in writing and whether you go and accumulate as much detail in your notes or in your research as you can, and then cull it down to figure out the best detail that will tell your story? Or do you start writing and start looking for what detail you need to add in order to drive and give life to the characters and the sense of place?
I'll go and then you, Jon, is that okay?
Sure.
I had a long background in narrative journalism before I tried fiction. And I think it really helped me write fiction. But the thing about narrative journalism is you are taking notes constantly, not knowing what you're going to use because this is series work, right? And so I know I've got to pile up, and I always tell my students, occasionally people are going to be boring when you're interviewing. That's the perfect time to keep writing, even if you're recording, and take down details of the environment when they're in at the moment. What are their mannerisms? How are they speaking in different ways? I'd always rather have more than I need than not enough. One of the challenges of writing fiction is I can't do what I do in journalism, which is if I need another quote, I can't just call somebody and ask them to follow up. It has to come from my mind, which I find ends up being a very busy place for this. And it takes time. The biggest challenge for any writer is to believe you are a writer. That's as true of a journalist as it is of a novelist. The first person who needs to acknowledge that you're a writer is you. And I remember in college looking in the mirror and saying to myself, you are a writer. You are a journalist. And it sounds so hokey, but now I find myself some mornings looking in the mirror and saying, you are a novelist, because it's coming out whether I'm ready or not. Jon?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more about writing everything down. I mean, it's almost pathological, the things that I notice and put down in my notes, and I need that. Going to your second point too. I mean, I feel like that's where I get that confidence from when I have to finally sit down and write, is knowing that I have way more than I can use. I know more about this subject than I could possibly ever write. And if anything, it does. One of the real difficulties I have when I am writing a piece is you know, it takes me a while to realize, oh, I'm just trying to wedge in this very delightful detail somehow. You know, I've rewritten this paragraph 8 times because I just wanted to get to the, you know, moment when they're all watching Antiques Roadshow or something, you know, and that really doesn't belong in the piece. So yeah, to me, that's where I kind of like, you know, draw my strength from when I'm writing, is just having that wealth of detail. And to me, it's also just the great pleasure of the job for me is getting to hang out with people and catch them being themselves, you know, in ways that they don't recognize. I've sort of always felt like I'm observing life, and now I've managed to make a job out of it.
Well, listen, I think I'd love to have this go on forever. And I wish you both resilience in your communities and in your homes. But I think we need to call it, and out of respect for your time and our attendees, we'll stop here and share any questions that we did not get to. We'll share them with you, Connie and Jon, and maybe you could reply later. So before we end today, I'd also like to encourage you to subscribe to our Covering Coronavirus newsletter, which contains best practices, tips, and self-care advice specifically for journalists. In it, you can also find information about our upcoming programs. And I'm going to try this, which is sharing a screen. Well, unfortunately, I don't have that capability right now, but you will see it when we send you our questionnaire. What we have is we have upcoming programs. On Monday, we will have a panel discuss how to identify and fix racial inequalities in COVID-19 coverage. And then on May 19th, we'll have a program called Writing Through the Power of Details in a Pandemic. So we hope that you've enjoyed the program. The Journalism Institute is here to serve you during this challenging time. And do let us know how we can do so in the survey about this program, which you'll receive shortly. And most important, you all stay well. Connie, Jon, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.